Hello, everyone. I'm Clay Wirestone, opinion editor at Kansas Reflector.
I'm Editor-in-Chief Sherman Smith.
And we are here to wrap up week 7 of the Kansas legislature session and look ahead to week 8. And Sherman, we are probably rushing towards the end of this thing, right?
If there's any mercy, we could be out within 2 or 3 weeks.
So we start as usual by looking back at what happened in this previous week of the session, and really a lot of the news coverage, a lot of what we were following had to do with the implementation of the anti-trans bathroom bill, SB 244, which also involved birth certificates and driver's licenses.
Yeah, this law took effect officially on Thursday, and the state sent out notification to everybody shortly before that about their driver's licenses, telling them that the letter said that their licenses were invalidated and that they would have to go get a new one if they wanted to be able to drive without being subjected to other penalties. So they're on the hook for $8 if they want to go renew these. I talked to a couple of trans individuals who, they're not happy about this. They knew it was coming, but it just, I talked to somebody who said just the reality of holding that letter in her hand sent her full of rage, and just drove home the idea, at least for her, that trans people need to leave the state, which coincided with a directive from a national group that said they actually issued a statewide evacuation warning for all trans people in Kansas based on this law. The other provision of this law, of course, is the bathroom part. Restricts bathroom use, but also leaves people vulnerable to lawsuits from anyone who feels aggrieved based on the restroom that you're using. And on Friday, we learned that late the night before, the ACLU of Kansas had filed a lawsuit on behalf of 2 trans men in Lawrence about this very issue. I mean, part of the problem here, of course, is as 2 trans men, nobody who looks at them would think that they had been assigned female sex at birth. But the law is going to require them now to use the women's room, and this will effectively out them as being transgender, something that they don't want to do. They've been subjected to harassment and bullying in the past. There's a lot in the lawsuit that talks about the actual harm that this causes people when they're not allowed to live their life as who they are.
Well, and I think it's important for us to say here too, based on what we talked about in the past, the law in question, SB 244, because it was passed in such an expedited way, both through committee and through the House and Senate, there's some real vagueness in the text. And it's actually the notion that the driver's license changes and birth certificate changes have to be done now. That is not something, I think, that based on some previous readings of the bill that we had done, that we were expecting necessarily to happen this week. The bill includes like July 1st deadlines in a couple of places and talking about those issues. Now, it may be that those dates don't have to do with implementation, but it's still a little interesting and something we're digging into a little bit.
One of the issues here is that most of the time, or at least the standard would be when you have a law like this coming through the legislature and it goes through the normal process, there's time for not just trans Kansans, but also for attorneys for cities and counties and others who are affected to come forward and say, we don't understand how this law is going to be implemented, and we need to clarify this in the law before it is passed. This actually came up during debate when the House moved to vote on this very law. Representative Bob Lewis, a Republican from Garden City, who had inserted the bathroom provision into the law and is an attorney himself, had to introduce amendments to his own bill basically on the House floor, fixing problems that he had failed to notice just the day before when he did this. And one of the issues that he took up was he got the House to support what's known as a severability clause. And this means if any one part of this bill gets struck down, the rest of the bill remains intact. So if a court, for instance, decided that the bathroom part was unconstitutional, but the driver's license part was okay, the driver's license part would still stay in effect. It doesn't strike down the whole law. Democrats, of course, quickly pointed out that what they were really saying as Republicans was, we know that there's a good chance that this bill is unconstitutional, or at least part of this bill is unconstitutional. Representative John Carmichael, a Democrat from Wichita, made that point specifically and said, you rush this through so that attorneys didn't have a chance to look at it and figure out what's really going on here, and now you understand that there may be some problems with the law.
And just from a journalistic perspective here, I'm just going to start a little sidebar and just say that one of the things that folks sometimes ask us, because, at Kansas Reflector, we obviously Sherman oversees reporters who write stories about all sorts of things, but we do cover stuff like this anti-trans legislation, and we cover it pretty aggressively. And sometimes people ask us about that and ask, why do you cover these kinds of stories in this way? And I think what you've seen kind of nationally the last few days in coverage about this story illustrates exactly why we approach these issues the way that we do. Essentially, you had a bunch of national publications all of a sudden start writing stories about Kansas and start saying, oh, there's this thing happening in Kansas that no one knew about that is just kind of erupted all of a sudden. And, and I spent some time, kind of arranging and looking at all of the coverage we had done on this. We wrote our first story on this subject back in October of 2025. So I think it's important for us and for our readers that, we really do try to document this kind of stuff.
We've covered this extensively, particularly senior reporter Morgan Chilson has been on the front lines of a lot of this. She had to sit through the 5+ hour debate in the House before this was passed, long committee hearings, trying to nail down specifics from the state about their advice for implementing this or their guidance for implementing this. She wrote about what happened when a similar bill was put into effect in Texas. She's written a lot of stories about this, and actually the lawsuit that the ACLU has filed over this now cites her reporting throughout that lawsuit, references it in numerous places in the lawsuit. But
that all being said, more things happened, and more things are happening. So let's talk just for a moment. It's something that we know that folks across the state pay attention to. A lot of people are interested in, and that has to do with the property taxes that everyone pays. A couple of bills went through this last week, one in the House, one in the Senate, trying to address property taxes in some way.
Yeah, the good news for folks out there who are very much interested in addressing property taxes is both sides have an idea for how to address this. The bad news is they can't agree with each other, or at least they haven't yet, and this has been a hang-up in the past. So the House passed a bill, legislation that would basically say if the property tax in your area is going to go up more than 3%, you could get just a sliver of the population to sign a petition that forces a vote on this, allows the public to say, we don't want that. The Senate side passed a constitutional amendment. This would still need the House approval as well as approval from a vote, popular vote among the people. But the Senate plan would say you're just simply not allowed to raise the valuations on property more than 3% in any year. Critics say this doesn't actually lower property taxes, it just shifts the burden around. But it would mean if you're a homeowner and you stay in that home, the valuation on your property could not go up more than 3% in a year.
Well, and there's always just the main point that everyone has needs. The state has needs, local communities have needs, counties have needs. We expect there to be schools. We expect there to be firefighters, all of these things. And so at a certain level, trying to keep some taxes down almost inevitably means that some other sort of taxes go up.
Yeah, we published a story from a freelance journalist named Dale Hogue out in Great Bend, who also took a kind of a longer look at the property tax issue and kind of how we got to this high burden being placed on homeowners. The simple version of that story, and it's an in-depth story, but the simple version is just that the legislature over the past 20 to 30 years has shifted the burden from commercial property to residential property. And that's why I think a lot of homeowners are feeling the strain.
So also, so another topic that I've brought up over and over again in these videos is following the progress of the House and Senate in passing a budget for Kansas. As we've said again and again, that's the one requirement that the legislature has every year, is to pass a budget. And after many weeks in which I talked about, things were moving, one of the chambers did finally spit out a budget last week.
Yeah, the House passed a budget by very, very close margins. Only 68 of the 125 members voted in favor of this, one of the closest votes that we've seen all year. The House budget cut spending from a year ago by about $100 million. That's short of the $200 million target that House Speaker Dan Hawkins had set out for them. And it also doesn't account for a number of other bills that are flying around that could add more money to what the state is actually spending. But as it stands, it would cut spending by about $100 million overall. There's about a 1.5% cut kind of across the board for state agencies. One of the curious things here is that it does not actually cut higher ed spending. They had put a target on universities in Kansas, public universities. This budget actually just says we're going to tie a little bit of the money, about $12 million or so, for universities based on whether they can certify that they have gotten rid of all the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on campus or content in their classes.
Well, and this then kind of pushes us into talking about this week, into talking about week 8. We're past turnaround now, so theoretically we're not seeing new bills come up, although of course, whatever folks want will ultimately happen. But now really, in terms of the budget at least, it's up to the Senate.
Yeah, the Senate has to pass their budget, and then the two sides will get together and work out whatever differences they have and arrive at that final budget before they adjourn for the first time, we'll say. So the process is the Senate will pass their budget, the two sides will work out those differences, they'll come up with a compromise, both chambers will then have to pass that compromise, the legislature will go home for a couple of weeks, and then they'll come back and there could be one final trailer bill we call a omnibus, where they reconcile all the stuff that they've passed so far, and it's just kind of one last chance to add or cut spending in the budget, and then they'll be done for good.
Well, and also Governor Laura Kelly will have a say as well. The budget will go to her. In general, in Kansas, budgets are not vetoed. It's happened a time or two, but it usually causes a lot of unhappiness and gets a worse budget in reaction.
Well, the one thing that she can do,
Yes.
though, which she has done in every year, is line item vetoes. Budgets are a little different from typical bills. In a budget, she can just strike one little part of the bill throughout. And so in a lot of the years we've seen, she might strike a dozen different things that the legislature wants to spend money on, where they, particularly if they earmark something as a no-bid contract for a special favor for somebody, she'll strike that, and then they could come back and try to override those on a case-by-case basis. The real issue here, though, that we're looking at is in the House, they're acknowledging that they are going to spend $500 million more than they are taking in revenue in the state. That's $500 million that's cratering the reserves that the state has, and eventually is going to send the state into financial ruin if they don't either severely cut the budget or find new tax revenue.
Well, and this is part of the issue with running a deficit, is that one-time changes don't make it, right? Because you have to whatever savings you find have to be able to carry over from one year to the next.
Yeah, the budget chair in the House, Representative Troy Waymaster, is already saying, we're going to have to look at school funding as the obvious way of balancing the budget in future years.
Some other stuff that's coming up this week. Our senior reporter, Tim Carpenter, is looking into some complex negotiations and back and forth having to do with unemployment insurance.
Yeah, this is happening in a House Commerce Committee. It's a big, confusing bill that they're looking at, but it's really dealing with some of the finer points of, I think, who can get unemployment insurance for how long.
Well, and it's something that seems to be part of a negotiation between both some business interests and some union interests in Kansas as well. So
we'll leave it to Tim to sort out what exactly this means.
We will see what they're going to be doing. Also, we've covered this before. The Senate passed a bill requiring a bunch of new kind of verification measures when it came to school lunch programs, and this bill is now heading over to the House.
Yeah, the Senate looked at an audit that said there's actually just a subset of people who get school lunches that fall into a particular category that, based on census data, suggests maybe some of those shouldn't have qualified for free or reduced lunch. And so the Senate used that to say, we want schools to verify the income levels of everybody. It's basically a big onerous administrative task for schools. The Senate kind of attached a provision that said, we'll go ahead and foot the bill for everybody who's on reduced lunch, which would be, something that a lot of Democrats and the governor want. But it comes with that caveat of you have to rigorously verify everybody's eligibility, which is also just kind of a tactic long deployed by, I think, conservatives to say, we're just going to force people into so much paperwork that they don't bother to apply for this to begin with. This has bigger implications for school funding because school funding is based in part on how many at-risk students you have. You get a lot more funding to serve at-risk students, and one of the ways you qualify as an at-risk student is if you qualify for free or reduced lunch.
And, yes, as Sherman says, it's something that it is known so widely that when folks estimate the budget effect of bills, if those bills include additional verification requirements for public assistance, it's almost always included in fiscal estimates that those bills are going to reduce enrollment, because that's just what happens.
I mean, and to be clear, it doesn't actually mean that there's fraud and abuse. It just means it's so much red tape that people give up.
Yes. And on that cheery note, we're going to go back and enjoy. We're taping this on Friday when it is a balmy 70-some degrees outside. We're enjoying that. I think it's going to get quite cold and snowy this weekend. So we're going to go try to enjoy that. My name's Clay Wirestone. Oh, yes, I've got to say, subscribe to our newsletter. KansasReflector.com/subscribe. That's KansasReflector.com/subscribe for our daily digest of news and commentary.
Thanks for listening, everybody.